Okay, so you know how we love to dig into these reports that kind of make you look twice,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Well, we found one from the World Population Review. It's from 2024.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about, you know,
This is juicy.
yeah, average number of sexual partners that people all around the world say they've had.
Oh, yeah. This will be good. So,
Always interesting to look at the trends there.
always interesting. Yeah. And like I said, sometimes it's kind of surprising what you find when you really look into it.
Right.
And as always, our, mission here is to break down the most, interesting bits of information and give it to you straight.
Yeah, pull out the nuggets.
Pull out the nuggets, exactly.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Watch 'em all drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
Okay, so you know how sometimes you kind of think you've got a feel for like global stuff?
Mm-hmm.
With like, which countries are more, adventurous or maybe reserved
Yeah.
when it comes to, relationships?
You think you've got a picture in your head?
Exactly. But get ready to have some of those ideas like seriously flipped on their head. Because today we are going deep into a report that is so fascinating. It's from the World Population Review. And get this, they put it out in 2024. What they did was they actually ranked countries around the world based on like the average number of sexual partners that people reported having.
And right off the bat, we want to acknowledge for everybody listening, this kind of data, it's not like perfectly precise, right? It's not like measuring, the height of a mountain or something.
No. Exactly. Think about it. People aren't always totally honest on surveys, right? And one's considered a sexual partner in one place.
Yeah.
It could be totally different somewhere else.
Absolutely.
And of course, who's even getting asked these questions like that makes a difference.
Yeah.
Huge impact. Yeah.
So we're kind of looking at, intriguing trends here, not necessarily like the absolute truth.
Yeah, think of it like we're getting these like fascinating glimpses into global patterns. But even with all of that said, right, even with those caveats, some of what they found is really surprising.
Like really surprised. I mean, I was looking at this stuff and I was like, whoa. For example, Turkey. They show up with an average number of partners that is like, whoa, hold on a second.
Yeah, Turkey's a fascinating one. And then you've got Germany. Their figures are pretty high, especially when you compare them to some of their neighbors.
Why? And then France. You think France, you think romance.
Right. The city of love.
But their average is actually pretty moderate. It's lower than you might guess. So we're going to break all of this down for you today, all these surprises and more. Yeah, and it's not just about the numbers themselves. What's really interesting is digging into the why. Like, why are these averages so different around the world? And we'll be looking at everything from, deep cultural norms to religious values. And we'll even look at how stuff like, the economy and government policies might play a role.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's try to understand this stuff region by region. Let's head up north first. Let's talk Northern Europe. Places like Sweden, Norway, Finland. What can we learn from their averages?
Well, one thing that's really interesting about those countries is that they often score really high when it comes to gender equality.
Right, yeah.
These are measures of things like women's participation in the workforce, their representation in government, access to education and healthcare.
Right.
It's about how much autonomy women have. And in those Northern European countries, we tend to see partner counts that are kind of mid-range to slightly above average.
So it's like maybe there's less judgment about things like dating casually or having relationships before marriage.
Yeah, that's a really possible connection. This idea of cultural acceptance around premarital sex could definitely be contributing to individuals having, a bit of a wider range of experiences.
Makes sense. All right, let's shift gears a bit. Let's go a little south and west. Let's talk about France.
Ooh la la.
Right, the land of romance. The city of love.
You'd expect, a certain something there.
Yeah. You would think so.
Yeah.
But the report actually says that their average number of partners is kind of moderate and actually a bit lower than what a lot of people might expect.
Lower than you'd think, yeah.
So what's going on there? Why the difference between the image and the reality?
It's a great question. One possible factor might be that France has really strong cultural values that emphasize long-term relationships.
Ah, okay.
Like the focus is on finding a life partner and really building that deep connection.
So maybe it's more about the quality of the connections rather than the quantity of partners.
Exactly. That could definitely be part of it. Now let's hop over to Germany. Their numbers were actually quite a bit higher than a lot of other Western European countries.
Yeah, they were like, whoa, Germany, what's going on?
Right. And if we kind of connect this to the bigger picture, it could be that in Germany, there's a wider acceptance of different relationship styles, maybe more openness to having multiple partners or a greater acceptance of sexual experimentation in general.
It's really interesting how you see these different patterns, even in countries that are right next to each other.
Absolutely.
Okay, now for one of the biggest surprises in the whole report, Turkey. They had a really high average number of partners, almost at the top of the list.
Yeah, Turkey's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because they've got this unique cultural position. They kind of bridge what are often seen as more conservative norms of the Middle East with, more liberal influences from Europe.
So what do you think is going on there that might explain that higher average?
It's probably a mix of things. Maybe we're seeing the effects of really fast social and economic changes happening in the country, different levels of religious observance among different groups of people, the specifics of their demographics. It all plays a role. It just goes to show you that you can't always make assumptions about a whole country based on, a single data point or a stereotype.
No, you can't paint a whole nation with one brush. Okay, let's travel a bit, shall we? Let's go down under to Australia. They also had a pretty high average number of partners.
Yeah, and Australia's high average kind of lines up with what a lot of sociological research has shown. They tend to have a more relaxed attitude toward casual relationships, more acceptance of different lifestyles, less stigma around having multiple partners throughout your life.
Okay, makes sense. Now let's hop over to North America. How do Canada and the U.S. usually stack up in these kinds of global surveys?
Canada usually falls somewhere in the mid to high range globally. And, maybe that reflects a mix of more liberal social views.
Yeah.
And at the same time, a lot of people still value those stable long-term relationships. The U.S. sometimes has some gaps in the data in these global comparisons, depending on the study. But when they are included, they tend to be in a similar range to Canada.
But the U.S. is massive,
Yeah.
right? So are there probably differences within the country itself?
Oh, absolutely. If you zoomed in and looked at different parts of the U.S., you would almost definitely find a ton of variation. Age demographics, religious affiliations, where you are in the country, like what flies in a big coastal city could be totally different from what's going on in a more rural conservative area.
Two different worlds sometimes. And finally, let's touch on Africa and Asia. The report mentioned they had a huge range of averages.
Yeah, and what's really interesting there is the sheer diversity. Across both continents, you've got countries with relatively low average numbers of partners, all the way up to countries with, moderately high figures. And those differences, they often reflect local traditions around marriage. Like in some parts of Africa, you have polygamy.
Right.
And then in parts of Asia, there are these really traditional conservative sexual norms that are very influential. And, just the general comfort level with even talking about sex openly, that can impact how accurate the self-reported data even is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, one thing the report really focused on was gender perspectives, which feels super important when you're talking about something as personal as this.
It's absolutely crucial to consider that. And one of the first things to keep in mind is that women might underreport their number of partners.
Oh, because of societal pressure and all that.
Exactly. And in a lot of cultures around the world, there's this huge pressure on women to, downplay their sexual experience because there's so much stigma around female promiscuity.
And on the other hand, guys might be more likely to
exaggerate a little.
Yeah.
There's often this expectation for men to have had more partners to kind of prove their masculinity or something. And this can really distort the data. You've got women underreporting men, overreporting. It makes it hard to get a clear picture.
Totally. So how does something like the level of gender equality in a society play into all of this?
That's such a good point. In countries with higher gender equality, Women tend to have more autonomy over all aspects of their lives,
Right.
including their sexual choices. There's less stigma attached to women having multiple relationships or a wider range of experiences. And as a result, the gap between the average number of partners reported by men and women, it tends to shrink.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about in more conservative societies where there's a lot of emphasis on no sex before marriage?
In those situations, women often face really strong cultural, familial, or religious restrictions on their sexuality,
Yeah.
which can definitely lead to lower reported averages for them.
Right.
But it's also worth noting that men in those same societies might find ways to kind of, work around those norms.
Right.
Maybe outside of their communities or through travel. And that can make the gap between men's and women's reported numbers even bigger.
And how are these rapid social changes that we're seeing in so many places impacting all of this, the way men and women report these things?
What's really interesting is how globalization and increasing urbanization are affecting younger generations, especially in places like Turkey, parts of Asia, Africa. They're exposed to so much more global media. And then you've got the rise of social media and dating apps. All of that has really shaken up traditional norms around relationships. So we're seeing an increase in the number of partners reported among young people in urban areas. And interestingly, the traditional gender gap in those reports, it tends to be smaller as these older norms kind of fade away.
It's like a whole new world out there for a lot of people.
Okay.
Okay, now the report also pointed out some super interesting and even what they called mind-blowing facts. Let's get into those. What about dating apps? What role are they playing in all of this?
Yeah, the report highlighted how online dating and hookup apps have definitely contributed to a rise in casual relationships, especially among younger folks in cities all over the world. It's so much easier to connect with people now, and that's probably been a big factor in those increases in average partner counts that we've seen in some countries. It really shows how technology can totally reshape our lives, even really personal parts of them.
Yeah, no kidding. And what was that other interesting fact? Something about divorce rates.
Right. The report suggested that in societies where divorce is more common and accepted, there's sometimes a correlation with higher partner counts overall, because in those societies, people are more likely to have several long-term partners over their lifetime.
Right.
So it's not always about having more partners at the same time or a bunch of casual flings. It can be about a series of serious relationships.
I see. So it's not always about quantity. It's about different chapters in your life and different relationships.
Exactly. It just shows how the whole idea of what a sexual partnership even is can be really different in different places.
Okay, another thing they talked about was the difference between urban and rural populations.
That's a really important distinction because it often gets lost in those national averages. Big cities tend to attract people who are more diverse, more mobile, and often more open-minded. You get a wider range of lifestyles and relationship norms, and that often means higher reported numbers of sexual partners. On the other hand, rural areas tend to be more traditional and conservative, so they often have lower reported averages. And the difference between the two within the same country can be huge.
It's wild. And then there was that whole thing about stigma and how that affects what people say in surveys.
Yeah, even when surveys are anonymous, people don't always tell the whole truth. Researchers call this social desirability bias. Basically, it means that men might feel pressure to exaggerate how many partners they've had.
Could look good.
Right, to seem more manly or experienced. And women might underreport to avoid judgment or being labeled negatively. It's a big challenge for researchers.
It makes sense, though. And the last mind-blowing fact was about economics and education.
Right. And the interesting thing there is that higher levels of education, and especially economic independence for women, are often linked with more liberal attitudes towards sex and relationships. When people have more resources and more freedom, they have more control over their lives, including who they're with. They can leave relationships that aren't working, and that can lead to more partners over time.
It's all connected. Okay, so let's try to tie all of this together. What are some of the big reasons and patterns that might explain why we see these global differences in average partner counts? The report talked about how accepting a culture is of sex before marriage.
Yeah, in countries where people are more open about relationships before marriage and where there's good sex education, you often see higher partner counts. Places like Australia and parts of Europe and North America kind of fit that pattern. When a society is less judgmental about premarital relationships, people are more likely to explore different connections.
And of course, there's religion and social norms in general.
Huge influence there. In many parts of the world, religious beliefs shape what's considered acceptable when it comes to sex and relationships. And generally speaking, more conservative religious communities often report lower numbers of partners. But like we saw with Turkey, it's not always that simple. Social change can really shake things up.
So it's complicated. Now, what about different generations? Are younger people changing things up?
Oh, definitely. Younger people today are growing up in a totally different world. They're surrounded by social media. Their ideas about relationships are evolving. There's more global cultural exchange. And these shifts in attitudes and behaviors can happen really fast, and they can definitely impact those averages.
Yeah, what was true for our parents' generation might be totally different now.
Absolutely.
And finally, there's the whole thing about economic development and globalization. How do those play a role?
Well, as countries develop economically, people often have more opportunities to travel. There's more global communication. And they're exposed to different relationship models and cultural ideas from around the world. All of that can lead to more fluid attitudes towards sex and relationships.
Makes sense. Wow, okay, we covered a lot. So to sum up our deep dive into this World Population Review data, it really shows us how diverse sexual behavior is around the world. And it definitely challenges some of those stereotypes we might have in our heads.
Totally. I mean, you've got Turkey with its surprisingly high average, Germany's numbers standing out, France being more moderate than you might expect. It just goes to show you that we can't make assumptions about entire countries based on simple stereotypes. Human behavior is just too complex.
And it's clear that there's no single explanation for these global differences. It's a mix of culture, religion, economics, gender dynamics, and so much more.
And it's important to remember that this data is based on what people say themselves. And that always comes with some bias. So we have to keep that in mind. These averages aren't the final word on anything. They're more like starting points for understanding.
Exactly. They make us think about the world differently and question our own assumptions. And they really highlight how much culture and education and changing social norms affect our personal lives.
So as you go about your day, think about this. How do these global patterns we've been talking about compare to what you see in your own life and in your community? It really makes you think about how different people experience relationships all over the world.
It really does. And that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.